Hi, and welcome to A Better Life Towards a Fairer, Greener Future. My name's Kat Smith. I've just started at Green Alliance as our head of social impact. So I'm working on making sure our policies deliver for people and for communities. And today I'm joined by Stuart Dossett, who leads our work on power sector decarbonisation, by Libby Peake, who leads our work on resources and circular economy, and by Steve Coulter, who leads our work on greening the economy. And I'm just going to kick us off with a quick introduction to the report, and then I'm going to hand over to the panel to discuss the policies in some more detail. At the moment, our government is facing a lot of complex interconnected crises. So that's growing geopolitical uncertainty, sluggish growth, rising poverty and inequality, alongside the escalating impacts of climate change. And the focus on a very narrow fiscal space is ignoring the fact that these interconnected crises and are pitting them against each other and ignoring exactly how interconnected these crises are. For example, it was fossil fuel prices which drove inflation, triggering the cost of living crisis, restricting growth and compounding poverty and deprivation over the last 4 years. And green investment can offer a path to addressing these challenges while creating jobs, improving resilience, and ensuring well-being for all. The policies listed in this report are not going to be the whole solution, and I'm not suggesting that they can replace things like functioning services or a well-resourced welfare state, but they are all ways that we can begin to address the fundamental drivers of the issues we're all facing and begin to build a better, greener future. Can you change slides, please? And the next one. And one more. Over the last few months, there have been a lot of conversations about security, which have taken up a huge part of the political conversation. And in this report, I wanted to talk about security in its most expansive sense. And that is people being able to access and afford what they need, when they need it, and having confidence they can and will be able to do that into the future. The graph that's on screen shows the wholesale price of gas since January 2021. And I think it really highlights the innate instability of a fossil fuel-based economy, particularly as competition for resources increase and geopolitics are becoming increasingly volatile. It was these wholesale prices that drove inflation, which damaged our economy, damaged communities, and which is still being felt by households across the UK. Next slide, please. So in the report, we approached this across 3 key areas. I'm not going to go into loads of details because the panel will be able to talk about it much more authoritatively than me. But we split it into energy, food, and resources. Energy, because building a renewables-based energy system has never been more urgent, but so too is ensuring that people have high-quality insulated homes and that households actually feel the benefit of the enormous progress we're making on renewables in their energy bills. On food, like a huge part of why our economy isn't growing is because the extent to which we have depleted the nature and ecosystems that our systems depend on. At the moment, climate change is costing the average household about £361 more a year in their food bills. And the least productive 10% of our farmland in the UK produces just 1% of our food. If we supported farmers to restore nature so that it could deliver broad public goods, that could strengthen our ecosystems, protect from flooding, and help to ensure that we're mitigating climate change. On resources, we import about 80% of the materials we use. And if we're building our economy on fossil fuels, a lot of that can only be burnt once. In a renewables-based economy, we have a growing reserve of resources that can be utilised through reuse, repair and recycling, whilst creating skilled jobs and growth across the UK. Next slide, please. Green policies can also deliver UK-wide growth. The green economy grew by 10% last year. That is 3 times the rate of the wider economy. Delivered well, green growth can create skilled jobs, particularly in underserved regions, and support struggling industries to lead in the new net zero economy. However, this isn't a given. The green economy will only deliver for communities if it is designed to do so. And that's why it's essential that workers and communities are at the centre of all our work on the green economy to ensure that it delivers broad benefits. Public transport is going to be a key part of that picture. It's investment that can deliver growth alongside decarbonisation and give new connectedness and leisure opportunities for communities while improving health and well-being. Next slide, please. And these policies don't just impact costs and jobs, they also deliver enormously for people's well-being. Green spaces, quality housing, clean air, and public transport all deliver broad benefits across public health and happiness. Next slide, please. So what we need is to move from interconnected problems to interconnected solutions. This report is about how we get to the heart of the interconnected solutions we face. Green policies can deliver across this government's agenda, and most importantly for our communities, because we are never going to deliver security, growth, or thriving communities without protecting the climate and our ecosystem. So that's everything from me. So then I'm going to move on to our panel. So Stuart, would you like to kick off?
Great, thanks, Kath, and hello everyone. So we wanted to start with a bit of discussion around energy, as it felt the natural place to start, given that for the last few years we have been defining national security as energy security, since Russia invaded Ukraine and sent the price of gas skyrocketing, which, as Kath mentioned, led to a big increase in our household energy bills and has fed into the ongoing cost of living crisis. Now, ultimately, it was our reliance on international fossil fuel markets that left us exposed to this insecurity. So I thought it was worth reminding ourselves the scale of that insecurity, as it really was quite staggering. Now, estimates suggest that the gas price crisis pushed the number of households in fuel poverty from 4 million to a peak of 7.5 million. Now, that rise in household bills of well over £1,000 per year was devastating for so many millions of households up and down the country, and it forced people into that impossible choice of whether to heat their home or eat dinner that evening. But the price rise that was experienced by households wasn't even the full extent of the increase. Now, the National Audit Office estimates that the government spent nearly £70 billion on energy bill support, of which nearly 50 billion was directed at households. So, how do we protect households from volatile international gas markets as a mechanism for increasing our energy security? The first is to build a power system that isn't reliant on gas. The government has ambitious plans to decarbonise the power system by 2030, which is the right thing to do for both an energy security and climate action. But just decarbonising the system isn't a guarantee of cheaper bills. There's choices that need to be made throughout the power system that impact the final price of electricity. And those are decisions that need to be actively taken by the government between now and 30 to ensure that this 2030 clean power mission does lead to a reduction in the household energy bills. And the second is to upgrade our homes and move to low carbon heat sources. Now, the government announced an ambitious warm homes plan in its manifesto prior to the election. Now, we're all eagerly awaiting what's going to happen in the spending review that's forthcoming in June. But I think one of the things that we really want to see is that strong ongoing commitment to that warm home plan to ensure that we improve the quality of people's houses. Now, these actions, though, they're not just good for security, they're also good for economic growth. The IMF, for example, has estimated that for every pound that is invested in renewables, the economy will grow by up to £1.50. So the UK's target to decarbonise its power system before any other advanced economy is also stimulating new investment into manufacturing in this country, be it a high voltage cabling factory up in the north of Scotland from a Japanese company, right through to Siemens, who have built a new factory for wind turbine components. So how can we transform the energy system though that's in a people-centered way? It wouldn't be an energy discussion at the moment without some mention of the topic du jour, which is national or locational pricing and which is better for households. Now, I think what the array of expensively amassed consultancy modeling that proponents on both sides of the debate show is that actually it's probably quite close and that we just don't know which approach isn't going to necessarily bring down bills. But neither is coming for necessarily a panacea for this. But what do we know that definitely will bring down bills? So firstly, we know that we need to break the link between electricity prices and gas prices. So despite generating only about 30% of the UK's electricity in 2024, gas set the price of electricity 98% of the time, compared to a European average of 40%. We need to break that link, firstly, by removing gas from the system wherever we can, and the government's Clean Power Mission should hopefully do that by 2030 if it can achieve that aim. But it's still going to be setting the price some of the time. So the government needs to be taking steps to ensure that gas doesn't continue to dominate the price that we pay for electricity, and those cheaper, cleaner, homegrown electrons that are produced from those turbines out in the North Sea are actually feeding through into lower bills for people up and down the country. The second is that we need to uphold the £13.2 billion pledge for the Warm Homes Plan that Labour committed to in their manifesto. Accelerating the uptake of heat pumps and through replacing gas boilers with them is crucial. The heat pump is about 3 to 5 times more efficient than a gas boiler, and expanding the home insulation alongside that are necessary steps that we can take to reduce energy demand while also cutting household bills. For example, if we had really kicked off with this in earnest back in 2022, and in a hypothetical world, we've been able to upgrade every home in the UK to EPCC, by 2030, households could have saved £24 billion off of their energy bills. Third way we can go about making sure that this transition works for people is reducing the funding costs for renewables. Now, because there are no fuel costs for renewables, the operating costs are actually a very small part of the overall life costs of the project. This means, though, that the financing costs of building new renewables do have a large impact on the price that they need to charge for their electricity. Now, interest rates went up substantially as a mechanism for tackling the inflation that was driven by fossil fuel price increases. And ultimately, this has led through to an increase in the cost of financing for renewables, the very cure for that malady. So we're calling on the Bank of England to introduce a term funding scheme for renewable energy developments. Now, this would enable low-cost loans for a fixed term period provided via commercial banks. And this would help the Bank of England to achieve one of its core objectives, which is price stability. And by providing that stable energy price, the renewables in turn protect the UK from future gas price shock and from spiraling inflation that we saw in 2022. And finally, we can reform the contracts for difference mechanism to give 25-year contracts. Now, the contracts for difference are the government's primary mechanism to incentivise the new build of renewables by providing them with a long-term contract that gives them price certainty. Now, the government's currently consulting on extending those contracts from 15 years to 25 years as a mechanism for reducing the financing costs of those projects and therefore reducing the price of the electricity from those renewables. And we call on the government to carry through with those proposals as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you, Kath, and welcome everybody to this Green Alliance seminar. So I'm going to talk about growth and especially green growth. So I expect everybody's tired of hearing about the growth problem that we have. Probably no one more tired than the Treasury and Rachel Reeves, because we do have a growth problem in that the economy is not really growing. Indeed, if you take account of rising population and inflation, it hasn't actually grown really since the financial crisis. Now, some in the environmental NGO space point out that growth is actually quite bad for the environment and nature, which may be true, but given the need to finance the investment in the green transition and investment in protecting nature, you do actually need some growth in order to generate the tax revenues to pay for this. And then hopefully it becomes less important as you built the infrastructure that Stuart was just talking about. And in a low growth situation, moving on to sort of social justice, there's also less money for public services. And it means, as we've seen, pressure to clamp down on the benefits bill rather clumsily, as the government did in the spring statement, in a sort of panic-driven measure to meet the demands of its fiscal rules. It ended up cutting a lot of benefits for disabled people, which will put them into poverty. So you need to plan ahead, but also you're less likely to fall into these traps if you do have a healthily growing economy. Growth is particularly important for net zero. So the Climate Change Committee estimates we'll need about £50 billion of annual investment in the green energy transition by 2030. Some of that will come from the private sector. A lot of it will come initially from the government. And again, if we don't have growth, we don't have the tax revenues. If we have government that has to spend, as is estimated, £600 billion just servicing its debt to international capital markets over the course of the rest of the parliament, that inevitably squeezes money that we can put to a lot better use. Low growth also means private companies retrench. They don't invest in green kit. They don't invest in reskilling their workforces. Consumers don't spend. They have less money to pay for their heating bills, to feed themselves, and the government is less able to step in with help for that. And so the government has its growth mission. We hear a lot about its growth mission. It's probably easily its number one growth mission. It wants to raise the rate of growth. It got off to a shaky start last year, and things have actually gone from bad to worse with with Trump's tariff war and the ructions in global supply chains, which will hit UK exports. So what was already quite a difficult mission has just got a lot harder. I think in some ways this is actually prompting the government to rethink what it says about growth. There were signs of this at the start of the year. Both Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves made a couple of speeches where they slightly diluted, or rather they clarified what they meant by growth in some quite important ways. So they talked about the quality of growth. So is this growth that's being spent on meaningless consumption, or is it money that's going into investing in clean power and our public services? There's also a new emphasis on the distribution of growth, so who actually gets to benefit from the growth rate. The famous quote in the Brexit referendum that Brexit would harm GDP, and a lady said, well, that's your GDP, that's not ours. This gets to the problem that even with a sort of relatively healthy headline GDP rate, growth rate, if it's not reaching everybody in the country, or even everybody outside the southeast of England, which is traditionally done very well in the UK's current economic setup, if it's not reaching beyond the southeast of England, a lot of people don't feel that they're enjoying the benefits of this, and they don't see why we should have this target. And frankly, I don't really blame them. There's a problem with how growth is defined. So we have this figure of gross domestic product. And as our recent work on the Desgupta review pointed out, this incentivizes the government to prompt people to consume, to buy stuff, to ramp up their house prices. It doesn't incentivize them to do sensible things, which is to invest. Doesn't incentivize the government to think about what really makes growth worthwhile, what really makes the economy worthwhile, which are real quality of life indicators. So access to education, the ability to make the best of your talents and commitment, the distribution of growth. So whether you're born in the southeast of England or Sunderland makes as little difference as possible to your life chances. So overall, with some of the work that's being done in government, and some of the things that the government's thinking about itself in terms of how it appreciates growth. I think of Rachel Reeves' interest in the everyday economy, which are the sort of non-sexy bits of the economy that aren't necessarily exported. They don't revolve around business services and financial services, but actually affect the bedrock of communities and make a difference, a real difference to people's lives. growing attention on this, I think, is a very, very welcome sign, because frankly, the government's breakneck pursuit of growth at the moment and clutching at things like building runways is not really producing a step change in our growth rate. So thinking a bit further ahead, thinking about the clean power mission, thinking about the new high productivity industries, for example, electric vehicles, thinking about the distribution of growth, so where these new industries can go, and thinking about how the proceeds from growth through tax revenues can pay for the things that really matter, which are good public services, decent infrastructure, and a good quality of life for everybody. I think are important, and we do actually now have quite a good opportunity. There are some conversations being had now that would have been unthinkable even a year ago. This has been prompted by by Trump's tariff wars and the feeling that the old globalized model of global growth is breaking down. The idea that the government would be talking about nationalization of steel and possibly other industries would have seemed crazy a year ago. Now it's fairly mainstream, and it's actually being done. So we're actually, I think, what is called a critical juncture in the economy and discussions about the economy, that we really do have an opportunity. In fact, we have an imperative to completely rethink what we think about growth and who it's supposed to benefit and how we go about it. That's all for me.
Great, thanks, Steve. And Libby, do you want to introduce?
Yeah, thanks, Kath. Thanks, everyone. I think Steve is absolutely right that we're at a critical juncture. And I suppose from my perspective, leading Green Alliance's work on resources, one of the things that means is that I think we're sort of well within our rights to anticipate that resources and resource security are going to become ever more important to discussions. It was already on the rise, but things like tariff wars are definitely going to make it more important that we are more mindful of where our materials come from. And as Kath highlighted at the start, we import the vast majority of materials. The materials that wind up in the products that we use, about 70 to 80% of them are extracted abroad. But if you think about the materials that are considered critical raw materials, so those are ones that are vital to the functioning of the economy, whether that be for climate, for aerospace, for electronics, for chemicals, for medical equipment, for all of these these sectors that are considered vitally important for the economy. They're needed for those, and they carry geopolitical or supply chain risks. So there's now considered to be 34 of them, and of those 34, the UK is 90% or more reliant on imports for 32 of those, and there are any number of those, including almost all of those that are used in critical in renewable infrastructure, where we're 100% reliant on imports. And so I think, especially if you're looking at the economy in general, resource resilience is going to be incredibly important. But if we just focus on something that's been in the spotlight and the government is focused on energy security, in the long term, the focus for that is going to need to incorporate resource security as well, and should absolutely be focused on that at the time already. And I think one of the things that the government needs to be more aware of, they're probably not aware of enough, is just how unusually exposed the UK is, even compared to some of the countries that we would consider friendly or would traditionally consider friendly, who do tend to have more of these sorts of resources geologically. The UK does have some of them. We've obviously we're hearing a lot about lithium in Cornwall. And we do have other sources, but quite often they're in really sensitive locations, like the Lake District has a lot of cobalt and things like that. So getting those out of the ground and decreasing our reliance on import is always going to be a challenge when we're looking at new materials. So we don't have very many in the ground. They're hard to access, but what we do have is lots and lots of materials that have built up around us because we've been importing them for so long, because we've got such a big, well-established wind industry, because we import so many products. We've got them all around us in the infrastructure and products. And as Kath said at the beginning as well, the thing about these is that unlike fossil fuels, which you have to extract out of the ground and you use once, if you get minerals and metals right, if you put the right systems in place, you actually only have to extract them once and then you can reuse them again and again and again. So Green Alliance has been advocating for the UK to use this moment as an opportunity to rethink what we're doing and to really put the focus on things like, first of all, reducing our demand for energy, which will reduce the demand for these materials and could do so substantially. And then once you have these materials in the country, making sure you've got the right systems in place to enable you to reuse them, to remanufacture products, to use them again. And then at the very end to recycle those. And that is absolutely going to make us a much more secure and resource resilient economy. I think that the logic is definitely there for critical raw materials, and increasingly, hopefully, it's being heard. The government has various initiatives that are looking into this, including a circular economy task force, which is writing a circular economy strategy for England. And full disclosure, I am on that task force, but everything I'm saying today is as a commentator from Green Alliance, not as someone on that task force. But there's also a new critical raw materials strategy coming out. There are industrial strategies coming out, and all of these things are processes through which you can start to embed a much better approach to energy, but also in other areas. And I think that although the critical raw materials tend to get a lot of the highlights, a lot of the attention, the logic of reducing reliance on imports, on continually having to extract materials, holds for other supply chains and other sectors as well. And the UK does definitely have an opportunity as a service-rich economy that doesn't do too much primary manufacturing, although we do some. We've definitely got an opportunity to start shifting the wider economy and our businesses so that we are reducing the need to continually import new, sometimes quite cheap quality products, which I think does have added benefits of increasing the number of jobs, improving people's satisfaction in terms of having better quality products, regenerating areas outside of London, and all sorts of other additional benefits. So there are plenty of opportunities to get this right, although it might feel like it's a bit of a crisis at the moment. We can definitely deliver if all of the various policy processes do take us in the right direction. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Libby. And we have the Q&A function open now. So if anybody who has joined the call wants to ask any questions, please do put them in there, and then we will try to answer any that we can at the end. I think one of the hardest things about this political moment is that there are so many critical moments happening all at once and so many critical decisions that need to be made. And so I'd be interested to hear from the panel which types of green investment you think would deliver the most for communities. And Steve, can we start off with you for that one?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, just fiddling with my mutes and whatever's. Yes, so look, I think there were a couple of things about the green transition that do actually lend itself very well to a sort of more extensive growth that the Treasury want. By extensive, I mean spread across the country. You could have a very high growth rate just in the City of London. If the City of London generated so much wealth that we had a very high GDP growth rate, that would be great. Generate lots of tax revenues. Great if you have a house in London. Be fantastic. Not so great if you're in the rest of the country. Actually, in some ways, we've had this kind of lopsided economy for rather a long time. We've been very, very reliant on services, especially financial services, that London and a few other regional financial services capitals like Leeds, Edinburgh have done very well, but the rest of the country has not really benefited as we sort of deindustrialized in other parts of the country. Now, the green transition offers us a way out of that for two reasons. Firstly, if you think about things like clean power, this is obviously not inside large cities. It's near the coast. It's on hillsides, or in areas where you can have hydrogen plants or even nuclear power stations, because we seem to be going there. This is obviously not in the well-developed, rich urban conurbations. Think about green manufacturing, for example, the car industry, which is undergoing a difficult but very important transition to building electric vehicles. These are based in our traditional industrial heartlands like the West Midlands and also Sunderland. These are areas where there aren't too many other industries. Most of what industry there is based on servicing these equipment manufacturers, these car manufacturers. And so the fortunes, the economic fortunes of these regions are quite tied into the prospects for these large industries like cars. And cars is the car industry is at a rather difficult moment to do with tariffs, but also cheap Chinese competition, but also just the sheer organizational, technical skills, industrial relations, market uncertainties about switching from one technology to another. And there, the government certainly needs to help, probably more than it's been doing, to enable that we still have a car industry, because while we might want to buy electric driven cars, we don't necessarily need to make them here. We could just import them from other countries. But we obviously don't want to do that. We want to make them here. We want to have the jobs and the wealth that will generate. We also shouldn't ignore the services industries as well. So everyone assumes the green transition is a sort of technical thing about building wind turbines and things like that. It's certainly partly that, but there's a services angle as well, which is good for the UK, because the UK is a very services-oriented economy. So when you think about the scale of the green transition, it's not just a technical transition, it's a massive organizational feat as well. And for that, you need professional services, you need lawyers, you need planners, you need accountants. So lots of potentially new or changed service sector jobs will be affected as well, and also generated by the green transition. And one of the few good things that came out of COVID was that we were able to move away from this idea where services jobs had to be in big, rich, prosperous cities like London. Several of us are joining this webinar, and I'm sure many people listening in to this webinar are actually joining from home. So the point is, with technology, you don't need to actually physically be where all your co-workers are, or also your collaborators or competitors. So working from home and the technology revolution that COVID has introduced means a lot of service sector jobs, which may be boosted by the green transition, don't have to be in the traditional urban conurbations. They can literally be anywhere, which offers quite a lot of potential for shifting service sectors jobs outside the traditional areas like the southeast of England. So I think the role of the government is to sort of facilitate these transitions in some areas, such as steel. I think they were right to nationalise steel. I think the government will still need to find a way of disposing of it while maintaining the jobs in the industry and also assisting the technological transition. Car industry, car manufacturers and their suppliers will need help in the transition. But I think the role of the government should be to have a plan, it should be to sort out the skills, power, infrastructure needs, and then let companies and individuals and sectors get on with it. But there is enormous potential for getting away from this business services driven southeast of England city financial wheeler dealing economy that's not served us particularly well in the past, and won't be appropriate for the future.
And I'll just jump in on circular economy in particular, because we've done a few bits of analysis that look at the job potential from growing a circular economy through increasing things like remanufacturing in particular, but also looking at things like repair, reuse, and recycling. And I suppose the thing about this sort of approach is that by its very nature, it will be more dispersed, because you will want more of the people who are going to be working on products to be closer to where those products arise. And so the analysis that we did showed that actually that some of the areas that are going to benefit most from the 450,000 jobs that could be created are outside of the southeast. They're in areas that have traditionally had poor employment rates, and sometimes often in jobs that have been lacking the right sort of employment, or jobs that could be sort of where skills could be transferred, especially if you're looking at some things like the remanufacturing of this of primary manufacturing. Quite often those sorts of skills are going to be complementary, and so they could be in the same place. But I suppose, as Steve says, there are also lots of different types of jobs to do with services and or logistics. So if you're expecting a circular economy to come on board, logistics are going to be really important, and those are the sorts of jobs that could be done anywhere in lots of instances. So there are lots of potential job benefits that I think people will be pleased to hear about. But in terms of other sort of community benefits, like quite often people do like a lot of things about the circular economy, the community side of it, the community aspect of it. People and politicians are quite keen on things like repair and having a revival of the high street through being able to access repair services and that side of things. So there's in some bits of the green economy definitely warm fuzzy things that we could be advocating for, and that people and politicians alike will be in favor of.
And do you think there's anything that we need to be building into our policies, or the government need to be building into their policies, that ensures that communities really do feel these benefits? Steve, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot that the government can do, and we've been doing some work on just transition in the green economy. I mean, there's basically there's a good and a bad way of doing these kinds of transitions. The bad way is just leave it to the market. Industries die. Eventually, they're replaced by new ones. This is what happened in Redcar with the closure of the steel mill there 5-6 years ago. Leave it to the market. Lo and behold, actually, many of the jobs were replaced, but they were all jobs on much, much lower wages. Those sort of basic service sector jobs in warehouses. Most of the skills had atrophied by the time the sort of government realized what had gone wrong. It was too late because people's skills had atrophied. The supply chains that serviced the industries built around the steel plant had all gone bust or moved away. And the social costs of this were absolutely incredible. The loss of businesses, good businesses, the loss of skilled, well-paying, highly productive jobs was considerable, and the welfare bill for the people who were left behind was considerable. So for the lack of slightly would have been just called for a bit of far-sighted intervention, I think we've ended up with a much higher bill. That's the bad way of doing the transition, just letting the market take hold and seeing what happens. There's a good way of doing it as well, which the Swedes and the Germans have done. For example, in the Ruhr, when the steel industry in the German Ruhr declined, the government intervened. It didn't necessarily save the industry, but it worked out a just transition plan. It involved workers, it involved trade unions, it brought companies together. It thought, well, what can replace these jobs that we would like to see? What's the new investment in technology that we're going to need? Now, bringing in unions should not be meaning the unions should veto change, because sometimes you do actually need change. Sometimes industries do need to restructure. But I think bringing in trade unions, bringing in workers, involving them in how to manage these transitions can be absolutely critical. Firstly, you get buy-in from the workers themselves. They also know a lot about local economic conditions, so unions can be very helpful in advising governments and companies about how to manage them. They would tend to sort of veto really catastrophic non-interventions like we saw in Redcar, and they will help build a consensus around what comes afterwards. So they will help ensure that there is a just transition that involves people, brings them with you, and so you don't get resentment, political opposition building up against these kinds of transitions, which we now see as fueling the vote for reform. So I think there's a bad way and there's a good way of doing things, and I think as you're starting to see with steel, government is getting on the right track to doing things the good way, and let's hope it continues. But you do need a plan. You do need a vision of where you're going, and chopping and changing the plan every 5 minutes, as for example we've seen with the ZEV mandate, as we've seen with some of the lack of an industrial strategy, a proper industrial strategy for so long under Conservative and Labour governments. I mean, we're now starting to see one, or we're about to get one next month. That's a good start, but yeah. Let's try and do it the right way by involving people and bringing them with us rather than just doing these transitions to people.
Thank you, Steve. And I think the other thing that has been putting an enormous amount of pressure on the green agenda at the moment has been the focus on security and security spending. And Stuart, I was just wondering if you could expand a bit on how you think we as a sector should be approaching this new pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess just first as a sector, we need to remind ourselves that national security encompasses more than just armed defense. As I mentioned before, since the Russia's invasion of Ukraine sent gas prices spiraling in 2022, national security has actually meant ending our reliance on volatile international gas markets by increasing homegrown renewable energy to promote energy security. And but defending the UK also increasingly means mitigating climate change, which is threatening to damage our economic security, which is vital to maintaining national security and well-being. So we need improving homes, rolling out electric vehicles, and investing in farming that supports food and nature, all necessary components of mitigating climate change. The government did announce that from 2027, it was going to be increasing its defence spending up to 2.5% of GDP, and it was going to pay for this by raiding the overseas development aid budget. There was a lot of voices making the argument very succinctly at the time that overseas aid is often your first line of defence when it comes to defending your country as well. What you are doing is you are providing targeted aid to the most vulnerable people in some of the most vulnerable areas, often those areas that are already experiencing most extreme effects of climate change. And cutting that aid is going to severely damage the long-term security of the UK. So one of the first things that I guess I should say here is that we, as a sector, need to be continuing to call for the reinstatement of that aid budget. But the flip side of that is that the announced defence spending increase so far is fully costed, to use the favourite phrase. But that doesn't mean that there aren't pressures that are going to come on the things that we are interested in terms of tackling climate change and improving the environment and moving to a more circular economy as a result of that. So the government has a very tight fiscal space that it's operating within, and there's a spending review coming up in June that has been hanging over us all for a very long time now. I'm sure Treasury feels much the same. But the defence budget is now essentially ring-fenced. There is going to be, therefore, when the government is looking at how to walk that tightrope, it has smaller pots to play with elsewhere that it can think about cutting if it needs to cut something in order to ensure it stays within its fiscal rules. And that is really where the sort of potential focus might fall on some of the green spending commitments that were made in the manifesto and subsequently, including, for example, the money that was committed to the creation of Great British Energy and the National Wealth Fund, or the Warm Homes Plan to improve the quality and fabric of our home. So when thinking about how this pressure might play out, I guess we can approach the question from the perspective of thinking about when does green investment achieve economic growth and national security, because they are really government's two biggest aims. The most obvious place is building out a cheap, secure, clean, homegrown electricity system. Now, that also has the benefit of being good for decarbonising heavy industry, for example, so such as steel production that you are going to need if you want a large defence industry. So you'll start to see very quickly that there are areas of mutual overlap between net zero, green aligned investment and actually the kind of investment you might want to make for defence purposes anyway. When I talk about defence, I mean sort of traditional armed military defence. Then these areas of overlap, I guess you then want to utilise those pockets of funding that you have to achieve both outcomes where you can without impacting on your ability to drive growth or on your ability to drive the net zero transition. So the National Wealth Fund, for example, the UK Infrastructure Bank was transformed into the National Wealth Fund and given additional funds of 5.8 billion to focus on investments in sectors such as steel, ports and offshore wind. What we've seen is the remit of the National Wealth Fund has been expanded since the Defence Spending Review to include defence spending. So I think a really important thing there, though, is identifying the fact that the existing funds that were within the UK Infrastructure Bank were still quite sizable. There is money within that National Wealth Fund, as it now is known, to achieve both of those aims. But what you absolutely need to do is ensure that that 5.8 billion that was allocated in addition to that organisation for those driving those high growth greening sectors is maintained and is kept. Then the second perspective thing about this, I guess, is around how can the government continue to get that economic growth that it wants through investment in the green economy, but how does it pay for it without just completely gutting its day-to-day spending or even its capital spending in other areas? So I guess the first would be thinking around the fiscal rules. Now, the fiscal rules were adjusted when the new government came in, as is often the way when a new government comes into force. They have changed many, many times over the years. But what we have seen in response, particularly to the big change that occurred when the presidency changed in the US and the mood music around NATO changed substantially, was that we had a big reaction in Germany, for example, where they have adjusted their fiscal rules to ensure that they could go out and provide the necessary public investment into the industries that they deemed to be crucial could be met. Crucially within that, they earmarked 20% of those funds for at least 20% of those funds to be specifically on climate-related transition investment in infrastructure. So they have shown that actually there is a credible path to adjusting fiscal rules and ensuring that money is spent in a way that achieves both infrastructure and climate ends. Though I should say that obviously the existing debt position of Germany is somewhat different to the UK, so it's not necessarily a route that we'll go down absolutely copying, but there's clearly scope to do that given the extraordinary geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in. Then another way of going around funding this is updating the tax framework, including the tax relief. Now, this is the approach that France is going down, for example, where they have said that in order to increase their defence spending, they are not going to cut any of their existing government spending plans, but they will look to the tax system as a way to raise those additional funds. And then I guess thirdly, the third way the government can do this is, and it has done this a bit already, is to cut funding for other departments in order to continue funding what it sees as critical. Now, the government's done this a bit already, as Steve mentioned. There were some cuts to the welfare. The initial pathway to increase defence spending was to cut the overseas development aid budget. But I think what you are increasingly seeing from very sort of credible voices is that there is only so much you can cut, and the scale of the spending challenges ahead are not likely to be able to be met just purely by spending cuts alone. So I guess it's just end with a slight plea there that the government thinks as creatively as it can, it ways in order to fund its agenda to achieve national security, to achieve clean power, to keep us on path for net zero, and to balance the fiscal books that it has without cutting every tiny piece of public spending.
Thank you. And I think one of the other big dangers with all this increased pressure on a relatively limited pool of spending is that green policies, when they are delivered in the cheapest way possible, or in the way that isn't as mindful as they could be for communities and how they deliver for people. And I was just wondering what you think we should be mindful of when we're designing policies in relation to like fairness and access and trust. Libby, do you want to go?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an incredibly important question, and I think it's increasingly important in the context of a lack of trust amongst the public in government, in mainstream political parties, in business to deliver the change that they want to see, and also in the context of fraying consensus on the need to tackle climate change amongst politicians, but also potentially amongst the public if it gets dragged into the culture wars. So I think gaining the public's acceptance and trust and understanding what they want in terms of policies, in terms of policy outcomes, but also in terms of how policies are developed and delivered is going to be increasingly important. And I think one of the most effective ways that you can create policy in a democracy is actually with a lot more dialogue with the public. I thought that the process a few years ago of the various select committees coming together to organize a climate assembly, which had a representative body of the population who really got to debate and understand the issues, who had multiple weekends of learning about climate science, was actually incredibly inspiring and a really good way to develop policy with public consent. I was lucky enough to give evidence on consumption, on things that we buy to the climate assembly, and they were so engaged. I remember when I was giving my presentation, there was a young man who I thought was really bored, who wasn't paying attention. And then after we gave the presentation and went around to talk to all of the different tables, he asked the most insightful questions. So it's a really great way to gain the consent of the population and to really understand what drives them, which I think is going to be incredibly important. On the topic of fairness, that's something that I've been increasingly thinking about and worrying about, because we know that unequal societies, unfair societies, have bigger climate impacts, but it also seems that they also make it harder to bring in effective policies to address the climate crisis. So I think we have a particular challenge in the UK because after the US, we're the most unequal society in the OECD, and that means that the wealthier have a big impact, but it also means that some of the more effective policies that you might want to bring in to reduce climate change become off limits because of the fear that it might negatively impact the least well off. And so as one sort of example, one thing that isn't politically palatable to advocate for at the moment, and I completely understand why, is something to do with addressing the costs of household gas, which currently benefit from a VAT reduction, which the EU has said is a subsidy to the fossil fuel industry. But because of the fear and because of the reality that a lot of people are already struggling to heat their homes, it's not something that you can advocate for change for until you start creating a more equal society. So if you look at where the benefits of that policy accrue, they accrue to the fossil fuel companies and they accrue to the wealthy who use a lot more energy and therefore benefit in their pockets from having that reduction. But the people who are least well off are not going to be able to afford even a small increase that would come from potentially rectifying that effective subsidy to the fossil fuel industry. And there's been plenty of analysis done that if you redistribute the funds in an effective way, the least well off could actually be better off. But I think there's a real and genuine fear that you will make it impossible for some people to heat their homes. So I think there are lots of other examples as well in the climate and environment space where that logic holds true. And I think unless we're making fairness and equality and public consent central to all of our policy making, we're never going to be able to implement the most effective policies.
Thank you, Libby. And we've done a lot of discussing the various challenges of this political moment and of the political agenda at the moment. But I was just wondering, where you see opportunities for the sector and where you would like the sector to go further on these kind of areas that were outlined in the report. And sorry, Libby, again, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of what we should be doing, what we could be doing differently, I think it's a challenging environment because of how the government's operating, because growth is the only game in town, and we do have to engage in that if we want to have a discussion with the current government. But I think we don't have to be limited to just engaging in that. We should engage with that conversation, with that sort of dialogue, but we do also need to think more about the long-term vision, about long-term sustainability, about long-term prosperity for the economy, which I think we have an incredibly good story to tell on that. We're not going to be able to achieve long-term prosperity without better protecting our environment. So I think framing the discussion around that, making sure we continue to talk to people and set out that positive vision for the future is going to be incredibly important.
Joe or Steve, do you have anything you want to share in your areas? Right.
Yeah, just very quickly, I agree with Libby. One clarification I should make about one thing I said before is that the steel industry has not been nationalized. It's been taken over by the government, and there's a bill that says it could be nationalized, hasn't been nationalized, might be in future. Just want to clarify that. Totally agree with Gabby. The problem I think we're in at the moment is that the easy wins from decarbonisation have been gained, and now it's the difficult stuff. It's behavioural change. It's stuff that hits people in the pocket. It's really, really important, because I think we're sort of losing the debate at the moment. It's really important that we make sure that we don't imply that ordinary low-income people are the problem, that we need to make them pay for this. I think it's the economy, it's the industrial and economic structure that's at fault, and I think this is what needs to bear the brunt of the change. And anything we do, I think, needs to take into account social justice. There's a sort of thing called Pareto optimality, which economists use to judge the fairness of a policy, which basically says, as long as you make someone better off and no one worse off with a policy, it's a good policy. It's applied to a lot of things in economics. It doesn't seem to be applied to the green transition. There do seem to be some things that we allow people to be made worse off through. I think that needs to end. I think we need to think about Pareto optimality whenever we discuss the green transition in conjunction with fairness and the just transition, because the two sides go together. So we can't make people feel that they are suffering from this, because most people get the need to combat climate change as long as it doesn't materially disadvantage people who already feel quite disadvantaged by the way that the economy and the political system works.
Great. Thank you. And thank you. That was a really interesting discussion. I'm now going to go into the audience Q&A. So if you do have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A now. So the two we have at the moment are, given the rather negative growth versus environment rhetoric that the current government have engaged in so far, does Green Alliance think that they will listen to the messages in this report? And do we need to consider reframing the narrative so that we are listened to?
Happy to kick off, and then others can join as the cogs were. There has been a bit of a negative growth versus environment rhetoric in a very limited place, I would say, I guess, which is largely in relation to the planning system. I think more broadly, the rhetoric and the early actions, I guess, in some places have been more positive. Obviously, I've focused on the energy system when I'm thinking here today, but the power sector, there is a very ambitious target to decarbonize it. And I think that very much ties in with the government's desire to achieve economic growth for the ultimate aim, or increasing tax revenue and using that revenue to improve public services and people's everyday lives. I think we should always be reconsidering the framing we're using on any narrative, to be honest. I think regardless of what the government is saying, whoever, I think we need to be thinking that carefully. But I think the messages in this report are getting through to government. I think they are hearing, not just from us, but others as well, similar things. The ability to act on them will become clearer once the spending review is out. And again, I'm thinking largely here in terms of the Warm Homes Plan. I think when we were talking about sort of fairness of policies and where we can go further, the Warm Homes Plan is such a huge opportunity to improve the lives of millions of households up and down the country by increasing the energy efficiency of those properties up to an acceptable standard of at least EPCC, and also to put in low carbon heating, which is far more efficient than gas boilers, but it's just held back by this quirk that we have with the system where a lot of the environmental and social levies fall on electricity rather than on the gas side of dual fuel bills, and therefore we are artificially inflating the cost of using a heat pump. So if you can fix some of those admittedly quite tricky issues, you have a huge opportunity to demonstrate to people on an increasing scale that the green transition is good for them. And you can really be pushing that positive narrative. And I think that can do a lot of good for our messaging, but also just more broadly for the environmental sector and for people.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. And then we have just one more question, which is what about driving up building standards, such as getting more efficient buildings so that they're cheaper to live and run, essentially?
I mean, I can comment on that. I think driving up building standards is a great way to achieve change in one of the highest impact sectors that is responsible for, on a consumption basis, so not the territorial emissions that we have targets for, but on a consumption basis, it's responsible for about 25% of emissions. I think it uses about 40% of materials and it creates 60% of waste. So sort of the building and construction sector is an incredibly impactful one, and also one that people, specifically if we're looking at homes, have a lot of interest in. Everybody has a home, everybody needs a home. We have really poor quality building stock in the UK in terms of our historic building stock, but also I suppose in terms of the buildings that are being created now. There are new standards coming into effect, but they're not as strong as they might be. The sector's gearing up for change. And Green Alliance has done a lot of work thinking about construction and talking to the construction industry about the things that would help it change. And it is quite a traditional sector that is resistant to change. So what we hear from them more than anything else is that if you want the sector to change, you do need to change the building standards. It's not to say that they all want stronger building standards, but that if you want the change, that is how you can deliver it. And I think you have seen that with subsequent changes to building regulations, they have been able to adjust their supply chain. The trouble is that there are various bits of trouble, but the additional bit of trouble is that the building standards only really apply to certain parts of operational emissions. So embodied emissions aren't accounted for. Not all operational emissions are accounted for. The new standards that are coming in will still mean that buildings will have to be retrofitted at some point to be compliant with a net zero world. So I think that there's definitely a really strong case to be made for improving building standards so that they're cheaper to run and live in, and also have a lower impact during the building phase as well, which it hasn't been covered at all so far.
Great, thank you, Libby. And we are overrunning a bit, so I think that's all we've got time for. But a huge thank you to the panel today, and thank you to everyone who joined. If you have any questions in follow-up, please do just email us and get in touch.